My friends, life has a way of revealing our true selves not through comfort, but through betrayal. When my own son, my blood, my legacy, emptied my bank account and vanished on a journey with his wife and mother-in-law, I felt something within me shatter. It was not only the loss of money, it was the collapse of trust, the erosion of a sacred bond between father and son. I sat in silence for days, feeling the venom of anger rising like a dark river inside me. The mind screamed for revenge, for justice. But beneath that fury, a quieter voice whispered, "This too is part of your story. Listen to what the pain is trying to tell you." At first, I was consumed by humiliation. It wasn't just the act of betrayal that stung. It was what it said about me. The voice inside whispered accusations. You failed as a father. You were blind. You trusted too much. I sat alone in the quiet of my home, feeling the echoes of that loss reverberate through every corner of my being. My son, the child I had raised with love, patience, and sacrifice, had not only taken my money, he had taken the image I held of myself. That image, polished over decades, was one of dignity, respect, and authority. I was the provider, the protector, the axis around which the family revolved. But in a single act, that illusion crumbled like dust in my hands. In Jungian thought, this is the moment when the ego, the persona we show to the world, collapses under the weight of truth. The ego loves to believe it is invincible, that it stands at the center of control. It builds castles out of identity. I am a father. I am successful. I am respected. Yet life, in its mysterious wisdom, will always find a way to expose the cracks in that fortress. When betrayal struck me, it was as if the universe had stripped me of every comforting label, leaving me naked before the mirror of my own soul. The man I thought I was no longer existed. It is terrifying, this death of the ego. There is no ceremony for it. No kind words or sympathy from others, because the world does not always recognize the quiet revolutions of the inner life. On the outside, people may see a man who has been wronged. Inside, however, something far more profound is taking place. The collapse of the ego is the beginning of an initiation. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The pain I felt was not only emotional, it was existential. It asked me to question everything I had built, everything I believed about love, loyalty, and even myself. For weeks, I wrestled with my own pride. My mind repeated the same story like a broken record. He betrayed you. You must make him pay. But beneath that noise, a quieter current began to flow. It was not the voice of rage, but of truth. It said, "This pain is not your punishment. It is your teacher." Slowly, I began to understand that the wound inflicted by my son was not meant to destroy me, but to reveal me. I had to confront the uncomfortable realization that my sense of worth had always been tied to external validation, to being the one who provided, who was looked up to, who was in control. His betrayal forced me to see how fragile that foundation was. In many myths, this moment is called the descent, the necessary fall before transformation. Think of Oedipus, who blinds himself after discovering the truth, or King Lear, who loses his kingdom and his sanity before glimpsing wisdom. The fall is universal. It strips the hero of illusion so that the soul can be reborn in authenticity. My story was no different. The humiliation I felt was not punishment, but purification. I was being freed from the tyranny of my own self-image. There came a night when I sat in complete darkness, no longer asking why my son did what he did, but what the event was trying to awaken within me. It was then that I saw the deeper pattern. I had identified myself with my role, not my essence. I had been so invested in being the father that I had forgotten to simply be a man. And in this forgetting, I had unconsciously placed myself on a pedestal. Untouchable, morally superior, indispensable. The betrayal shattered that illusion, and in doing so, it returned me to humility. Jung once said that the ego must die if the self is to emerge. The self, unlike the ego, is not a mask but the totality of who we are. The conscious and the unconscious, the light and the shadow. The ego wants to be admired, the self wants to be whole. When my ego fell, I finally began to sense the presence of something deeper, something wiser, within me. I realized that my suffering was not unique. It was archetypal. It was the suffering of every parent who has ever been disappointed, of every human being whose carefully built identity has been torn down by life. The strange thing about such collapse is that, once you stop resisting it, you begin to see its beauty. The pain becomes a kind of clarity. The humiliation becomes humility. I started to see how much of my life had been governed by fear. The fear of being irrelevant, unneeded, or unloved. My son's betrayal tore open that fear, and though it hurt, it also liberated me. I no longer needed to perform the role of the infallible father. I could be vulnerable. I could be human. In everyday life, we often cling to our identities as if they are permanent, but they are not. The teacher may lose his voice. The leader may lose his following. The parent may lose his child's respect. These losses, though cruel, are invitations to rediscover what lies beyond the roles we play. My role as father had been emptied, but the deeper truth of my being, as a soul seeking wholeness, remained untouched. That realization was the first spark of freedom. The ego's fall is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a truer one. It is the space between the death of illusion and the birth of meaning. In my case, it was the realization that my worth did not depend on my son's actions, or on any title I held, but on my ability to face myself without flinching. I began to see that revenge, in its truest form, was not about retaliation. It was about resurrection. It was about allowing the collapse of my false self so that something real could take its place. I often recall Jung's metaphor of the mask. The persona, he said, is like clothing. It allows us to appear in society, to play our parts. But when we mistake the mask for our face, life intervenes to tear it away. My son was the instrument of that tearing. I had hidden for too long behind the mask of authority, pride, and wisdom. His betrayal ripped it away, exposing the vulnerable man beneath. And though I felt naked, I also felt strangely alive. When the ego falls, the soul breathes again. I no longer needed to maintain the illusion of being perfect or powerful. I could admit my failures, my fears, my mistakes. I could meet myself honestly, and in that meeting, I found something stronger than pride. Authenticity. That was the true beginning of my revenge, not to rebuild my old image, but to rise beyond it, to let the deeper self, quiet, compassionate, and unshakable, take its rightful place. The collapse of the ego is not a tragedy, it is an awakening disguised as loss. And though it begins in humiliation, it ends in freedom. My identity as a father, as a man, was shattered. But in the shards, I discovered a mirror reflecting something eternal, the soul, waiting patiently beneath the ruins, ready to speak at last. When I looked inward, I saw not just my son's greed, but my own hidden darkness. My pride, my control, my unspoken expectations. It was as though a mirror had been placed before my soul, and in its reflection, I saw not only the wound inflicted by another, but the shadow I had long refused to acknowledge. This recognition did not come easily. It came with resistance, with the painful shattering of my assumptions about who I was. We all like to believe we are the light in our own story, the victim of injustice, the moral center of our small universe. But the deeper truth is far less comforting. We each carry within us the very darkness we condemn in others. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is that hidden side of our nature, the part that holds our repressed desires, anger, envy, pride, and fear. We banish it to the depths of our unconscious, because it does not fit the image we wish to show the world. Yet no matter how deeply we bury it, the shadow does not die, it waits. It finds ways to reveal itself, often through those closest to us. Jung once wrote that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. And so it was that I met myself. Disguised as my son, his betrayal tore away the mask of virtue I had worn for years. I had told myself that my authority as a father was love in its highest form, that my guidance was wisdom, and my control was care. But beneath these noble justifications lived a hidden hunger, the need to be obeyed, to be right, to be seen as the moral foundation of my family. When he took what was mine, it wasn't only my money that vanished, it was the illusion that I had been selfless. I had built my fatherhood on pride and possession, and his rebellion exposed it for what it was. To see one's own shadow is among the hardest tasks a human can face. The mind resists it with all its might. It points outward. He wronged me, she deceived me, they betrayed me. It refuses to admit that every conflict, every act of betrayal, carries a secret message from the unconscious. Look within and see what part of yourself you have disowned. When I began this painful inner examination, I realized that my anger toward my son was not only about justice. It was about projection. I had projected onto him all the parts of myself I refused to face. My rigidity, my pride, my unacknowledged ambition, they had all taken form in him. We imagine our children will be our redemption, that they will live the life we could not. But too often, they become the vessel of our unlived desires, our unhealed wounds. My son's rebellion was the rebellion of my own repressed spirit, demanding recognition. It was as though life itself had conspired to show me what I had hidden, not to punish me, but to complete me. There is a moment in every life when we are invited to enter this dark territory of the soul. It comes in many forms: betrayal, loss, illness, failure, anything that strips us of certainty and forces us to see ourselves clearly. At first, it feels like death. But Jung taught that this descent is not the end, it is the beginning of transformation. The shadow is not evil in itself, it is merely that which has been denied. When we dare to face it, we recover a part of our wholeness. When we deny it, it governs us in secret, shaping our fate from the darkness. I remember one evening, alone in my room, I felt the full weight of my anger rise within me. I wanted to curse my son, to punish him in words or action, but something stopped me. A quiet awareness that this fury was not new. It was ancient, inherited, a force that had lived within my family for generations. My father, too, had been a man of pride, of stern control disguised as guidance. I had once sworn I would never become him, yet here I was, standing in his shadow, repeating his pattern. That night, I saw that the real betrayal was not my son's. It was mine. I had betrayed my own soul by refusing to see what I had become. It takes great courage to look into the abyss of one's own heart without judgment. The temptation to justify or to turn away is overwhelming, but the longer we resist, the more power the shadow gains. It begins to appear everywhere, in our words, our relationships, our misfortunes. It becomes the unseen architect of our suffering. And so, I made a vow to confront it, to stop blaming and start seeing. I wrote down everything I felt, the anger, the shame, the need to control, the fear of being powerless. I treated them not as enemies but as messengers. Each emotion carried a fragment of truth, a piece of myself that had long been exiled. As I worked through this inner darkness, I began to feel a subtle shift. The energy that had once driven my rage started to transform into understanding. I saw that my son's greed was not born of malice alone. It was also born of emptiness, the same emptiness that had once lived in me. His hunger for independence was my own unfulfilled desire for freedom. His defiance mirrored the part of me that had always longed to break free from the weight of duty. He was not my enemy. He was my reflection. In confronting my shadow, I discovered that true revenge is not the destruction of the other, but the illumination of the self. The world teaches us to retaliate, to strike back, to restore our pride through domination. But the soul seeks a deeper justice, the kind that comes from insight, not vengeance. To illuminate the darkness within is to reclaim our power from the very forces that once enslaved us. It is to transform bitterness into wisdom, pain into depth, and humiliation into compassion. It is said that the wound is where the light enters. My wound was betrayal, and indeed, it became the doorway to understanding. Without that pain, I might have lived my entire life blind to my own shadow, enslaved by pride, pretending to be whole while secretly fractured. Through that wound, the light of consciousness entered, harsh, uninvited, but ultimately healing. There is a paradox in this journey. The very darkness we fear contains the light we seek. By turning toward my shadow, I did not become smaller. I became larger, more real, more human. The rage I once felt toward my son softened into empathy. The need for control transformed into acceptance. The pride that had blinded me gave way to humility. I began to see that my son, in his imperfection, was the instrument of my awakening. To confront the shadow is to stand face to face with the truth that we are not purely victims or villains, but both, and neither. We are the sum of light and darkness, the dance of creation and destruction, endlessly seeking balance. The revenge I once sought was not mine to claim. My task was different: to see myself clearly, to embrace what I had denied, and to walk forward not as a perfect man, but as a whole one. And so, the betrayal that once burned like poison became medicine. The darkness I feared became the teacher I needed. When I looked inward, I did not find evil. I found humanity, flawed, fierce, and yearning for light. The shadow had emerged, and in its presence, I finally met myself. At first, I planned to destroy him, to expose, to humiliate, to reclaim what was mine. The idea of revenge seemed righteous, almost purifying. I wanted him to feel the same pain, the same despair that I had endured. The fantasy of retribution whispered to me like a dark melody. Make him suffer as you have suffered. It offered the illusion of control, the comforting thought that if I could only hurt him back, justice would be restored. But as those thoughts consumed me, I began to sense that something within me was dying. The fire that I thought would cleanse me only burned me more deeply. My nights became heavy with bitterness, and I realized that revenge, driven by hatred, is like drinking poison and expecting the other to die. That recognition came slowly, painfully. One night, I found myself staring into the darkness of my own room, feeling the weight of my fury pressing on my chest. I asked myself, what is this anger trying to create? What do I truly want? To heal or to destroy? It was then that a new idea began to form in my mind. What if revenge could mean transformation instead of destruction? That question changed everything. It shifted the direction of my energy from outward blame to inward alchemy. In Jungian psychology, alchemy is more than a medieval pursuit of turning lead into gold. It is a metaphor for the transformation of the human soul. The alchemists believed that the prima materia, the raw, impure substance, contained within it the seed of gold. In the same way, our darkest emotions hold within them the potential for wisdom and renewal. Hatred, grief, humiliation, these are the lead of the soul. But through conscious reflection and inner work, they can be transmuted into compassion, strength, and purpose. I realized that my hatred, as raw and painful as it was also energy. Energy that could either destroy or create. I began to see my pain as a material to be worked with, not a burden to be carried. Instead of feeding my resentment, I started asking what it could teach me. This shift did not happen overnight. It was slow, deliberate, and often agonizing. There were moments when I wanted to fall back into anger, to justify my bitterness as justice. But each time I did, I saw that it led only to emptiness. My son had already taken my money, but if I allowed hate to rule me, he would take my soul as well. So I turned inward, not to escape the world, but to begin the work of transformation. I studied my thoughts, my emotions, my reactions. I noticed how my anger masked grief, how my pride disguised fear, how my longing for revenge was really a longing for meaning. It was as if I had been living in a fog of unconsciousness, and betrayal had torn it apart. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And so I began to make my darkness conscious. In that process, I discovered that the energy of revenge could become the energy of creation. I began to rebuild, not out of necessity, but out of choice. I took the emptiness, financial, emotional, spiritual, that betrayal had left behind, and I poured it into new forms of expression. I wrote, I taught. I spoke with others who had been wounded by those they loved most. I found that sharing my story did not weaken me, it strengthened me. My suffering became a bridge to others, a source of empathy rather than shame. Each time I spoke my truth, the poison in my veins turned a little more into power. I began to feel a strange kind of gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for what it revealed within me. It showed me that I was capable of transformation. It showed me that I could turn pain into purpose. I realized that the truest revenge was not in returning harm, but in refusing to be broken. The more I worked on myself, the clearer it became that my son and those who supported his actions were still trapped in illusions. Illusions of entitlement, pride, and justification. I saw that my freedom came not from punishing them, but from no longer being controlled by them. My forgiveness was not a gift to them, it was a liberation of myself. It was the moment I reclaimed my autonomy, my inner gold. The alchemy of the soul requires patience. The raw material of suffering does not turn to wisdom overnight. Just as the alchemists endured long nights tending their fires, waiting for transformation, so too must we tend the fire within us. Every time I resisted hatred, every time I chose understanding over blame, I added another spark to that sacred fire. Eventually, the heat of that fire began to melt the hardness inside me. What had once been rigid and vengeful became fluid, alive, and capable of love again. I came to understand that revenge, in its highest form, is not destruction but transcendence. It is saying, you did not destroy me. You awakened me. That awakening is the gold the soul seeks. The world may not see it, but within the inner landscape, it shines brighter than any victory over another person. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are, beyond the masks and wounds imposed by others. My son's betrayal, painful as it was, became the catalyst for my individuation. It stripped away my illusions and forced me to find a self that could not be stolen, not even by betrayal. When I finally looked back on my experience, I saw that my so-called revenge had taken an unexpected form. It was no longer about humiliation or dominance. It was about creation and wholeness. The same energy that once drove my anger now fueled my purpose. I had not reclaimed my money, but I had reclaimed something far more precious: my power, my dignity, and my peace. I began to meet others who carried their own versions of betrayal. Friends who had been abandoned, parents who had been forgotten, lovers who had been deceived. I saw in their eyes the same pain I once carried, and I told them what I had learned. That every betrayal holds the seed of transformation, if we are willing to face it. The wound that bleeds today can become the light that guides tomorrow. Through this alchemy of the soul, I learned that we cannot choose what happens to us, but we can choose what we make of it. Pain is inevitable, bitterness is optional. What begins as poison can end as medicine if we have the courage to transform it. The act of turning inward, of facing one's suffering honestly, is itself an act of power. It means saying, "You cannot define me by what you have done to me. I define myself by what I become because of it." In the end, my revenge was not against my son or his companions. It was against my own smallness, my own unconsciousness. It was the rebellion of my higher self against the tyranny of hatred. And as I walked this path, I discovered something extraordinary. That the greatest triumph over those who harm us is not in their downfall, but in our rise. The gold of the spirit shines brightest in those who have suffered, for they have learned to transmute darkness into light. And so my revenge became my redemption. My pain became my teacher. My loss became my liberation. Through alchemy, I had turned poison into power. In time, I began to understand something profound. My son was not just a betrayer, he was also a messenger. The pain he caused was not random cruelty, but the echo of a deeper truth. One that had been silently living within both of us long before the moment he emptied my account. At first, I could not see it. All I could feel was anger, disappointment, the unbearable sting of betrayal. But as the rawness softened, as silence replaced rage, I began to sense that his act was not merely his own. It was the manifestation of something ancient, something passed from father to son, generation to generation. He had revealed to me a mirror that life had been waiting to place before my eyes. Through that mirror, I saw not only his flaws but my own reflected back. The same pride that I condemned in him lived in me. The same hunger for control, the same silent belief that love must be earned, not freely given, had taken root in both our hearts. Jung once said that the child lives out what the parent has not resolved. And so, I began to see my son's betrayal not as an isolated wound, but as an inheritance. A continuation of patterns that neither of us had understood, but both had embodied. I began to recall moments from his childhood, subtle instances that at the time had seemed insignificant. The way I praised him when he achieved, and withdrew when he failed. The way I measured success through stability, security, and wealth, rather than through authenticity or joy. I believed I was preparing him for the world, teaching him discipline, resilience, and respect. Yet beneath my intentions, there lingered a quiet message. That worth must be earned, that love is conditional, that one's value lies in performance. Without realizing it, I had been planting in him the very seeds that would one day sprout into betrayal. And what of him? He, too, was a victim of his own inheritance. Perhaps he learned to take before being taken from, to assert power before feeling powerless, to protect himself in the only way he knew. What he did was wrong, deeply wrong, but in a sense, it was also inevitable. For he carried not only his own choices, but the unhealed wounds of his lineage. When I saw that, my anger began to dissolve, replaced by something more humbling and human compassion. The greatest burden a child must bear, Jung wrote, is the unlived life of the parent. When I encountered that line, it pierced me like a blade. I realized that my son was carrying the weight of my own unlived dreams, my unspoken fears, my unacknowledged shame. I had given him the best of what I knew, but the best of what I knew was limited by what I had not faced within myself. My life, though outwardly stable, had been quietly driven by fear, fear of failure, fear of scarcity, fear of being unworthy of love. That fear had shaped my parenting, my marriage, my work. It had also shaped my son. The child becomes the mirror of the parent's unconscious. What we do not heal in ourselves, we hand to them as destiny. I saw now that my son's betrayal was a reflection of my own inner betrayal, the betrayal of my authentic self. For years I had suppressed my own desires, compromised my truth for duty, pretended to be whole while quietly fractured inside. How could I expect him to act with integrity when I had not always lived it fully myself? How could I demand transparency when I had hidden parts of my own soul behind the mask of control and righteousness? This realization did not excuse his actions, but it illuminated them. It showed me that beneath every act of wrongdoing lies a web of pain, stretching across generations, binding parents and children in unconscious repetition. We call it betrayal, rebellion, disrespect. But beneath those words lives a deeper story. The psyche's desperate attempt to restore balance, to bring to light what has long been suppressed. My son's act, destructive as it was, became a symbolic message from the collective unconscious of our family. An urgent plea for awareness, for healing, for liberation. As I sat with these thoughts, I began to see the futility of resentment. Anger no longer gave me power, it drained it. The more I fed it, the smaller I became. Forgiveness, on the other hand, felt like a kind of rebellion. Not weakness, but strength. It was not the naive forgiveness that denies wrongdoing. It was the deeper kind that sees beyond it. Forgiveness became my final act of revenge. Not to absolve him of responsibility, but to free myself from the chains of bitterness that kept us both imprisoned. When I forgave him, it was not a single act but a gradual surrender. Each day, I released a little more of the story I had been telling myself. The story of the victim, the martyr, the righteous man wronged. I saw that by clinging to that story, I had kept myself small, defined by pain rather than by wisdom. Forgiveness was the act of reclaiming my narrative, of saying, this pain will not define me, I will define it. In time, something remarkable happened. The image of my son in my mind began to soften. I no longer saw him as the enemy, but as a mirror, one that had shown me what I most needed to see but least wanted to face. I began to feel gratitude, quiet and strange, for what the pain had taught me. Without his betrayal, I might never have looked this deeply into myself. I might have continued to live with my shadow unexamined, projecting it outward, blaming others for what I refused to confront. Through this realization, I learned that to see the self in the betrayer is not to justify the betrayal. It is to reclaim the part of us that the event reflects. Every person who wounds us is, in some mysterious way, a reflection of something within us that longs for recognition. The people who hurt us the most often become the greatest catalysts for our awakening, if we are willing to look beneath the surface of pain. When I finally looked at my son, not as my betrayer, but as my teacher, something within me transformed. The line between us blurred, not because we became the same, but because I saw how deeply we were connected. The same blood flowed through our veins, the same fears whispered in our hearts. What separated us was not morality, but consciousness. He acted out what I had repressed. I saw what he could not yet see. In this way, his darkness became the path to my light. Jung taught that what we most need to find will be found where we least want to look. For me, that place was my son's betrayal. Within it lay not only pain but revelation. The realization that we are not isolated beings, but threads in a vast web of inheritance and meaning. When I forgave him, I did not erase the past, I transcended it. And in doing so, I discovered a truth that will live with me forever, that love, when purified by awareness, can outgrow the wounds that once threatened to destroy it. To see the self in the betrayer is to glimpse the divine paradox of human life, that even through pain, we are being led toward wholeness. My son had not only broken my trust, he had broken open the walls around my soul. And through that opening, compassion entered, where once there had only been pride. What I saw in him was not just his shadow, but my own. Extended through blood and time, now brought into the light at last. As months passed, the pain softened. Time, that ancient healer, did not erase the wound, but it allowed the raw edges of suffering to settle into something quieter, something almost sacred. I began to see that the betrayal was no longer my enemy, but my teacher. What had once felt like the end of my story now revealed itself as the beginning of another, a deeper, more truthful chapter of my existence. It is strange how tragedy, when faced with courage, becomes the doorway to transformation. I had spent so long resenting the act that shattered me, yet slowly I realized that it was precisely that shattering which had set me free. When everything familiar was taken from me, my money, my pride, my image of being a good father, I was stripped down to my essence. There was nothing left to hide behind, no titles or roles to protect me from myself. I was forced to meet the one person I had neglected all these years, the self, that quiet center Jung spoke of, the eternal presence beneath the masks of personality. I began to understand what he meant when he said that. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. My son's betrayal had exposed not just the darkness in him, but the darkness in me. The unacknowledged fears, the silent dependencies, the illusions of control. In the early days after the incident, I thought I wanted justice. I imagined reclaiming what was mine, confronting him, proving my righteousness. But slowly I came to see that justice, as the ego defines it, would never heal me. What I needed was meaning. For meaning gives shape to suffering. It transforms chaos into coherence. As I began to rebuild my life, I realized that revenge born of hate is destruction, but revenge born of awareness is creation. My rebuilding was not about restoring what I had lost, but about creating a new foundation, one built not on pride, but on presence. I began to live more quietly, not out of defeat, but out of a newfound wisdom. The world no longer demanded my performance. It invited my participation. I no longer sought validation through my role as father or provider. Those titles had become too small to contain the fullness of who I was becoming. I had entered what Jung called the second half of life, the stage when the outer achievements lose their grip, and the soul begins its deeper work. In the first half of life, we build careers, families, reputations. In the second, if we are lucky, we learn to let go. There is a subtle liberation that comes when the things that once defined us fall away. I began to wake each morning without the familiar weight of expectation pressing upon my chest. I no longer needed to prove myself through others. I began to write again, not for acclaim, but for understanding. I tended a small garden behind my house, finding in the soil a reflection of my own inner landscape, seeds buried in darkness, waiting patiently for light. Life, I realized, always grows again, though never in quite the same form. In that silence, I found peace. Not because justice was served, but because meaning was restored. Peace came not from the world outside me, but from the reconciliation of the world within me. I saw that everything that had happened, the betrayal, the loss, the humiliation, had served a sacred purpose, to return me to myself. Jung said that the goal of life is not perfection but wholeness. Wholeness includes both light and shadow, joy and grief, betrayal and forgiveness. I had spent much of my life chasing perfection, trying to be the ideal father, the flawless provider, the man who never faltered. But it was only in my failure that I found the humility necessary to become whole. There were nights when I would still think of him, my son, and feel the echo of the old pain. But even then, something in me had shifted. I no longer saw him as the source of my suffering, but as the instrument of my awakening. He had played his part in the mysterious drama of life, and I had played mine. Without his betrayal, I might have continued living as a man of the world, respected, comfortable, admired, but spiritually asleep. I might have remained trapped in the illusion that identity comes from what we possess or control. I might have continued to measure my worth in currency and approval, never realizing that the real treasure was buried within. It is humbling to admit that the people who wound us often serve our evolution more deeply than those who love us gently. Pain has a way of cracking open the shell of complacency, forcing us to confront the truths we avoid. I once believed that wisdom came from study, from discipline, from books and philosophy. Now I know it comes from suffering well, from allowing pain to carve you open without hardening your heart. The heart, when broken rightly, does not close, it expands. I began to understand what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, beyond the expectations of society, beyond the roles assigned by family or culture. My individuation began the day I stopped defining myself by what was taken from me and started defining myself by what I had found within. The loss had stripped me of everything false. What remained was real. What remained was me. Sometimes when the evening light falls gently on my desk, I imagine my son somewhere far away, perhaps still chasing the illusions I once chased. I do not pity him, nor do I hate him. I simply understand. Each of us must take our own descent into darkness before we can find the light. Each must confront the shadow, face the ruins, and discover what cannot be destroyed. That is the law of the psyche. It is the eternal pattern of death and rebirth, of ego falling so that the self may rise. If he ever returns, I will not greet him with anger, but with quiet eyes that have seen the depths and returned. Not because I have forgotten, but because I have remembered. Remembered who I truly am beyond the story of betrayal. The man he tried to break no longer exists. What stands now is someone both softer and stronger, soft in compassion, strong in truth. And so my revenge, my true revenge, was not to hurt him back, but to become everything that betrayal tried to destroy. For what greater vengeance is there than to thrive in the face of what was meant to ruin you? To live not in bitterness, but in wisdom. To turn pain into understanding, loss into freedom, and ruin into revelation. That is the alchemy of the soul, the secret that suffering conceals. In the end, I discovered that life's cruelties are not punishments, but initiations. They break us only to reveal what cannot be broken. They strip away our masks so that we may see the face beneath, the face of the self, eternal, luminous, and free. I did not find justice in the way I expected. I found something far greater, the quiet joy of becoming whole. And that, I now understand, is the truest form of healing. The moment when ruin becomes revelation and pain becomes purpose. My friends, betrayal will visit each of us in some form, often when we least expect it, through a loved one's silence, a friend's deception, or life's own cruel irony. Yet hidden within that pain lies an invitation, the call to awaken. When the foundation of our trust crumbles, what remains is not emptiness, but the possibility of becoming more conscious, more alive. It is in these moments of profound loss that the soul whispers, "Now you will see who you truly are." When we face our shadow with courage, we reclaim our power from despair. When we choose to forgive, not to erase the past, but to rise above it, we transcend the cycle of hurt. Jung reminded us, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." These words are a torch for the wounded heart. So I say, choose meaning over bitterness, transformation over vengeance. Let your suffering refine you, not define you. For in the alchemy of pain, the soul discovers its gold. In the end, it is not betrayal that shapes us, but our response to it. Beyond every wound, there waits a deeper light. And it is toward that light we must walk.